My name is Francisca Saavedra. I am a tropical conservation and development consultant. I'm also alumna and one of the co-organizers of this panel series with Bob Buschbacher and Andrea Chavez. Let me go to the next one. Let's start the intro. So I would like to start today's panel with a land acknowledgement. I am aware that the University of Florida does not have a land acknowledgement. So the one you have here is a modification from one produced by the library at the University of Florida. Land acknowledgements are a first step towards truth and reconciliation in a history of colonial occupation and sadly also genocide. They are also a beautiful expression of gratitude, respect, and even reverence to the indigenous peoples whose territory you and I reside on, and a way of honoring them, indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from immemorial times. The pictures there are from the Seminole people and the Potano people that lived in the area where the University of Florida is located. And I know there are some of you here, they are relatively new to the Tropical Conservation and Development Program, and I wanted to explain very shortly about the program. The TCD is actually not a department, it's a research and interdisciplinary program, training program that has a long history actually of collaborative work with communities, practitioners, and other local organizations to bridge theory and practice and advance biodiversity, conservation, sustainable development, and the well-being of people, mostly in the tropics. TCD has three main objectives. One is to train graduate students, mostly from developing countries. Two is to encourage research that is solution-oriented. And three is to build, strengthen, and expand learning and action networks. And this is very much connected to what we're going to be talking today. So TCD has been doing this work for, you can correct me, 30, even 40 years, I think. And the picture that you have here is an image from one of the recent TCD projects on governance infrastructure in the Amazon, GIA. And GIA demonstrated, like many other projects, the leading role that forest and riverine people play in protecting the lands and waters and where they live and where they have sovereignty, where they have a governing power. They have protected, like many other indigenous people and local people, their lands and waters, not really as conservationists, but really as a response to their worldview, where they see everything interconnected, where they don't see often humans as more important than other living things. This image here is the group of partners, GIA partners in the Amazon. GIA, by the way, was supported by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundations for 3 years. And if you want to learn more about the GIA, I think Laura will put in the chat the link to the project. But just this is to have a visual image where these partners, GIA partners are. And what's important here is that TCD, GIA engaged in conversations with many of these Amazon partners to articulate a vision on how we could respond and contribute to the call to protect 30% of the earth and lands and waters. This is the call from the Convention on Biological Diversity. And what emerged from these conversations is actually a shared vision, a shared academic and indigenous vision of conservation that was very much aligned with biocultural conservation approaches. This was important because this in turn inspired TCD to carry, I would say, a profound year-long self-assessment. And part of this work was to understand the theory and the practice of biocultural conservation. Another aspect was how to assess how academia could contribute to biocultural conservation. And the image that you have here is a summary of how we thought academia could contribute to biocultural conservation. You see the importance of collaborative work with indigenous people and local communities, a work that will co-produce knowledge, the transdisciplinary aspect, and a work that is impact-oriented in many ways, so in training, in legal solutions, in governance, etc. Also, the other part of this work was a proposal of how TCD could put this biocultural conservation approach into practice. Laura, perhaps you can share those 3 long documents that were produced in the last year. They're very long, so we're not going to explain them here. Okay, so we are arriving now to today's topic. So today's panel is called Language, Knowledge, and the Environment, Implications for Biocultural Conservation, and will be led by the distinguished Dr. Luisa Maffi, Dr. David Stringer, and Dr. Marianne Ignace. This is actually the 4th and last panel of this biocultural conservation panel series. And the reason this topic is relevant, we're going to talk about language, and we're going to probably understand more at the end of this panel, the link between language, culture, and biodiversity. And this whole panel, today's panel, is actually part of the same effort to try to understand and deepen this conceptual understanding of the field and see how it can be implemented. I have this next slide. I just want to show you, because this is the 4th, so we have a first and a second and a third. And here you see Dr. Faisal Mullah, who was our first speaker, talking about indigenous-led conservation. We have the second led by the Field Museum. You see pictures of Dr. Paula Unger, Chris Jarrett, and Anna Lemos. And last month, we have Dr. David Sanville, who talk about biocultural conservation, biocultural education, sorry. So all goods have an end, and so today is our last panel. And this is one of our distinguished panelists. This is Luisa Maffi, Dr. Luisa Maffi. Laura, perhaps you can put the link to TerraLingua, and we can learn a lot more about her there. I just want to say a few things about Luisa. She is the co-founder and director of TerraLingua, and she's one of the pioneers in the field of biocultural diversity and conservation that was established actually in the mid-90s. That's about 30 years ago. I met Luisa last year as part of this research to try to understand the role of academia in biocultural conservation. And I had one first interview and many other conversations and a lot of more email exchanges since that first interview. I think this whole process has built trust between us, and I was there to say friendship. Luisa is an idealist who has devoted her life to advancing biocultural diversity and conservation. She has done this with a sense of mission, passion, and an extraordinary generosity of time. And I would say these are sort of the hallmarks of great leaders. I don't even know if she ever sleeps. She has, in my opinion, the most beautiful mind and heart. Luisa is a trailblazer, and as she said to me once, her ideas were quaint when she co-founded TerraLingua, but now I think the world is ready for them. Her perseverance has opened the road for these ideas over the years, and we are beneficiaries of her life work. We, I think, are very grateful and honored to have her here with us. I certainly am. And our second panelist is Dr. David Stringer. He is an associate professor, soon to become professor in the Department of Second Language Studies in Indiana University. David's main research areas are language acquisition and environmental linguistics. And his recent work and interest is on language hotspots and biodiversity, examines how ecological knowledge is encoded in endangered language. Fascinating. David is a very good-hearted and humble human being, and it has been really a gift to get to know him a little bit in the last few months. We are even reading the same book. This is Dr. Marianne Ignace. She is a professor in linguistics and indigenous studies at Simon Fraser University. She's also the director of the Indigenous Language Studies and First Nation Language Center at Fraser University. She is a linguistic, an anthropologist. She is German by birth and Canadian, I guess, adopted country. And she has published extensively about the intricate connection between language, environmental knowledge, and cultural norms. And she is currently focused on Indigenous language documentation and revitalization. And she was elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada for this work not that long ago. I would leave it here and pass the baton to Luisa. And I'm really, really grateful for having these great scholars with us today. It's really an honor. Thank you.
When I proposed the idea of this panel on language and environment to wrap up this series, David and Marianne were the two people who came to my mind right away. I've known David for, I think, over a decade, and although we are yet to meet in person, but we have collaborated in many ways over the years, and he's the most bioculturally oriented linguist that I've ever met, probably the only one who's used the case studies from my co-written book on biocultural diversity conservation with his students, linguistics students. So he has a lot to say, as you will see, about the many ways in which language encodes environmental knowledge and environmental values, etc. Marianne, I've known only for the past few months directly, but her fame precedes her as one of the most committed linguists in Canada to the cause of language, First Nation language revitalization. And I was blessed to be invited to participate in the submission of a major grant proposal to explore the role of language and traditional knowledge in many crucial issues, environmental and social issues in Canada and beyond. We hope that grant proposal will be approved, and I look forward to working with Marianne one way or another. I will start share screen and okay, and here's all right. Okay, can you all see?
Yes.
Okay, so as I mentioned at the beginning, I want to start with the question of what's language got to do with biocultural conservation. And that's of course the question that one of the questions that lies at the center of the work that we have been doing at TerraLingua. TerraLingua has been around for more than 25 years, close to 30 years now. But I could give you a narrative of we came up with this idea of language, knowledge, and environment, but that wouldn't be a true narrative, and that's why I wanted to start with the antecedents. And one of them has been there from time immemorial, and that's the view of indigenous peoples. I chose one among a myriad quotes that I could have chosen. From the Mi'kmaq nation here in Canada. The voice of the land is in our language. So the land speaks to people and its voice, it's heard through the language that people speak. And it's the kind of idea that we wanted to convey with the logo of TerraLingua that you see here in the background. But there's also antecedents from a long time ago in linguistics and linguistic anthropology, starting, for instance, with one of the fathers of North American linguistic anthropology, Edward Sapir, who said, language bears the stamp of the physical environment in which the speakers are placed, while reflecting the interest of the people in such environmental features. This is a more rationalistic way to put it. But again, it was noted already in the early 20th century. And maybe this way of doing linguistics was long forgotten because linguistics became more and more theoretical. And when it reemerged in the early 90s, frankly, most of us had forgotten or had never even learned about these antecedents, but they are there. Likewise, Peter Mulhoisler, an Australian linguist, said human languages are memories of human inventiveness, adaptation, and survival skills. Then most relevant and directly relevant to the beginnings of TerraLingua is the Declaration of Belém of the International Society of Ethnobiology, which was founded by one of my mentors, the late Darrell Posey. And this is probably the very first mention, recorded mention of the idea of an inextricable link between cultural and biological diversity in 1988. When I later met Darrell, and he became the mentor that he was for me, as a linguistic anthropologist, I asked, Darrell, but what about linguistic diversity? Isn't that also part of the diversity of life? And he slapped his thigh and said, I was wondering when someone was going to bring that up. Go for it. And so I did. And less than a decade later, that led to the beginnings of TerraLingua. Another important precedent that I want to mention is that the international conference that launched TerraLingua and then resulted in the book that you see there on biocultural diversity was held on the Berkeley campus. I am an alumna of the anthropology program there. And it was hosted by the Department of Integrative Biology, which you see in the lower picture there. Very generously and wholeheartedly, the biologists there thought that there was something to that idea. And we were locked up in a room for 3 days with a group of 30 people discussing these ideas. At the beginning, people were thinking, what are we doing together? And at the end, I couldn't push them out of the door. It was so intense and so, I guess, revelatory for a lot of people who had thought that interdisciplinary meant an entomologist talking to a herpetologist or something like that. So it was, and indigenous peoples participated. So it was really what started this whole process that TerraLingua has been on ever since. we ended up calling this interconnectedness of biological, cultural, linguistic diversity, biocultural diversity for short. And these were the tenets that we came up with, the interrelated and interdependent manifestations of the diversity of life on Earth at the global level, which arises from the interconnectedness of language, culture, and environment through coevolution and co-adaptation at local levels. And from that, we derived the ideas that the vitality of languages and cultures goes hand in hand with the vitality of ecosystems, and vice versa, that endangerment of one is also cause endangerment of the others, or goes hand in hand with endangerment of the others. Again, as a precedent of collaboration between linguists, anthropologists, and conservationists, this is a map that we produced in collaboration with the World Wildlife Fund and UNESCO. The first one was in 1998, and this subsequent map from 2002. This was meant to show how the distribution of the world's languages, standing as a proxy for cultural diversity at large, maps onto the world's ecosystems or ecoregions to be more precise. And as you can see, each dot stands for one of the 7,000 plus languages spoken in the world today. And they do tend to concentrate in the tropical to equatorial regions of the world, and to be more widely and sparsely distributed in other regions, whether desert or tundra, the distribution is more sparse. We found correlations for this kind of distribution, environment that are richer in biodiversity and water and other resources favor localization, other environment, as well as montane regions, other regions where resources may be more scarce, require people to range over a larger territory. And so this was mostly a demonstration. It drew a lot of critiques, such as people don't live in dots, which of course we never meant to suggest. But at the global scale, you can't represent people's territories. And of course, that's all implied in here. And getting close to home, to where you are in Florida, here's a map that was a result of a collaboration with your very own Rick Stepp. Another kind of representation here, it's the global distribution of plant diversity, again, overlay with the distribution of language diversity, and it gives you more gradients rather than this kind of hotspot type of idea. But you can still see the concentration of those language dots in those particular regions, which we then also represented this way. These are the core areas of biocultural diversity, including the Amazon basin, particularly of particular interest to you all at the program. Is Central Africa and Indo-Malaysia and Melanesia. But again, that's not meant to say that there is no biocultural diversity in other areas, or that language and traditional knowledge are not important elsewhere. It's just a fact of biogeography and how people interact with it and adapt to it. And to go back to the antecedents, interestingly enough, after we did all this mapping, I discovered that another father of American anthropology, after Alfred Kroeber, in studying the peoples of North America, had noticed the distribution of their territories mapped very closely the variety of ecosystems. He wasn't yet using that word, hadn't been invented, but noticed that correlation already in the early 20th century. So we may think we are so smart, but actually we are always walking in the footsteps of our ancestors, as indigenous peoples would say. But again, these things were brought up maybe at the right time, and so it took on, and here we are. Another way in which we looked, tried to understand this correlation was to compare trends in global linguistic diversity and global biodiversity. And so we compiled data, time series data on the status of the world's languages, which is what you see in the top graph. And sadly to say, and this was a project that ended in 2005 and badly in need of being updated. But that's what showed there overall. Linguistic diversity measured in terms of decline in the number of native speakers of each of the world's languages was going down overall. And that trend matched very closely the trends shown in the Living Planet Index that measures biodiversity. It's a WWF, a report that WWF puts out every year, I believe. And so just a quick representation of why that trend is happening with the world's languages. The bands in color that you see in this graph are the top languages in the world by number of speakers, from Chinese to Spanish to English to Arabic and so on. And over time, the gray band represents all the other languages put together. So of over 7,000 languages, basically only maybe up to 25 occupy an increasingly large space because of the way dominant languages siphon off speakers from minority languages, many of which have only, a few thousand or even a few hundred speakers, but even much larger ones are being eaten up or gobbled up by these dominant so-called world languages. And that's what explains the trends in linguistic diversity, although, with the language revitalization movement that has been happening in recent years, I'm hoping that we will begin to see a reversal of that trend. And as just an example, in the report on the state of the world of the languages of British Columbia, that is put out every year by the First People National Cultural Council, they have added one language to the list of languages in British Columbia because a language revitalization program started, and there are now speakers in the younger generation who are learning the language. So the hope is that the trend will slowly begin to reverse. And going back to the question with which I started, what's language got to do with it? My two distinguished co-panelists will have a lot more to say about that. But what I can tell you from the work that we have done, in particular, the work that went into this book, Biocultural Diversity Conservation, which we published over the decade, 15 years ago, we surveyed a number of projects, 45 projects around the world that could be considered biocultural in nature, that really took not only nature conservation or biodiversity conservation into account, but sought to integrate it with cultural conservation as well. And lo and behold, the projects that in our analysis were most successful at doing bioculture conservation were ones that were initiated and led by indigenous communities, and that included language revitalization as a part of the mix. So that was a really striking observation, and I think I will leave it here and leave it to David and Marianne to expand on why that is the case. So thank you, and over to David. I'll stop sharing.
Okay, hi everyone. Can you see my slides? Okay, great. Well, it's a real honor to be here. And it's not just an honor, it's a pleasure. Sometimes many of us who are working in particular academic fields who become interested in more interdisciplinary issues feel somewhat alone in our departments and feel the need to find new niches out there in the world. And it's always extremely exciting for me to discover new sort of blossomings of research and collaboration to do with biocultural diversity, such as this fantastic community that you have down there in Florida. So it's a real pleasure I feel that this is a beginning. I'm hoping I'll be able to speak with more of you in the near future, and we'll get to know each other a little better. So I'm going to talk for 15 to 20 minutes, if I keep my eye on my watch, about linguistic reflections of environmental knowledge. So the idea is in this short talk is to really speak to people who are not linguists primarily, but who are working in biocultural diversity conservation from other perspectives, from biology, from geography, from development, research, etc. And going back to Luisa's initial question, what has language got to do with it? Which of course makes me think of the song, what's love got to do with it? And the answer to that is a lot, actually. I think the more you get into this area. I'm going to ask the question, how is ecological knowledge reflected in language? And to give people an overview, at least from my perspective, of several different ways that people are often unaware of, that ecological knowledge is encoded in endangered languages. So it can be, ecological knowledge can be encoded in the mental lexicon, that is in the words in our head. This is both in terms of words, which in linguistics we call open class items, because you can keep adding to them. You can add more nouns, you can add more verbs to an existing language quite easily, but also grammatical morphemes, which are called closed class items, because you can't just easily add new definite articles or new prepositions to a language. We find that traditional ecological knowledge is encoded in both these open class and closed class systems. More generally, ecological knowledge can be reflected in linguistic expressions of space and time, as we'll see. And it can be woven into texts, into larger narratives, into sayings, into stories, into songs. So language is more than just the nuts and bolts of how you put it together. It's also what you can produce creatively with those nuts and bolts. And of course, we need to think about language when we translate into languages of wider communication, because there are all sorts of issues with that. So first of all, let's consider the mental lexicon. I mean, what are we to make of the rather typical, equivalent word lists of species that we often see between two languages? Are names in different languages truly interchangeable? Once you've got a list with translations, are you done? Well, as Posey recognized himself when he produced this list, bees in Kayapo. There's a lot more in words than this aspect of denotational meaning, pointing at something out there in the world. I think it's easier to illustrate with examples. So anybody recognize this flower? Very well-known flower. So these, I took this picture of foxgloves while hiking along the paths of my childhood in the Lake District in England a couple of years ago. There's an important difference in meaning between sense and reference. So if you walked around the country where I was brought up, around England, and you asked people in different regions, and you said, what is this flower? Some people would tell you it's foxglove. Some, like where I am from, foxglove, witch's glove, fairy fingers, fairy weed, witch's thimble, flapperduck, puppy duck, dead men's bells. So all of these names point to the same external referent in the world, but clearly meaning is more than that, right? So the sense of a word is its meaning in relation to the linguistic system of which it is a part. So when you translate from an indigenous language for a particular species, for example, into either scientific nomenclature or into a dominant language, the fact that both words point to the same thing in the world doesn't really get at what the word actually means in the language that you're looking at. Here's another example. You can find these wild orchids growing in the mountains of Luzon in the Philippines. In Ilonggot communities, these orchids, these mountain orchids are known collectively as lampung, the spirits of high places. But there are many different types of orchids. And the types of orchids in those mountains are given names which are body parts of the spirits, meaning their thighs, their fingernails, their braids, their thumbs, their fingers. There is a medicinal steaming cure when a patient sits under a blanket with a pot containing a boiling botanical mixture, where the different body parts of the mountain spirit are added to reassemble the spirit of the mountains. Through steaming, the body of the spirit enters the body of the patient and is asked to lift the curse of the sickness. So clearly an orchid by any other name, to borrow from Shakespeare, would not be part of the same cultural world at all. Let's look now a little at the structure of the mental lexicon. The mental lexicon is not like a dictionary where you have lists of words in 2 dimensions in alphabetical order, obviously. But it does help when you study linguistics to think of how words are related to each other. It's best to think of the mental lexicon as a kind of network, or actually multiple interacting networks. And we're very often, as linguists, interested in the relations between these words in the mind. You know, if you hear this particular word, what other words are primed or activated? So there are various types of relations you can have between words in the mind, homonyms, synonyms, antonyms, meronyms. But today I'm going to look at just a couple of lexical relations of particular relevance to ethnobotanists, polysemy and hyponymy. So polysemy is when there's one word with 2 apparently different meanings, but there is a relation between those meanings. This is different from homonyms, for example. A homonym is something like bank as a financial institution, bank as a grassy slope. They've got nothing to do with each other. But polysemy is when there is, in fact, a predictable systematic relationship between 2 apparently different uses of the same word. So, for example, in Vininj-Gunwok languages in Northern Australia, the term allure is used to describe these beautiful grasshoppers, who are also known as the children of the lightning. The term is also used not only for the grasshopper, but for the bush where you can find the grasshopper. And it's also sometimes used for the lightning itself, because the appearance of the grasshoppers herald the lightning and tell people also that the rains are coming and that this is the time to go and gather wild red apples, green plums, and black plums. Here's a picture of this beautiful creature. And it would be a mistake to think that you can only find such polysemy in exotic, faraway, indigenous languages. You can find this all over the world in all languages, because that's just the way that human beings are, and that's the way human language is. So in Indonesia, there's another example in Kanekes. Binglu is a kind of tree, but it's also the name of the skin disease that the tree is believed to cause. Here on the eastern seaboard of the United States, shad is a type of fish, but it's also a type of tree that blooms when the shad migrate upstream. The shad bush, when it's in bloom, heralds the migration of the shad. Of course, the English colonists who gave the name shad to this fish were not the first people to celebrate these fish migrations. The Lenape people had a 6-week celebration of the shadfish every year. Another type of lexical relation that's interesting to be aware of if you're doing this kind of interdisciplinary work is hyponymy. So hyponymy is what you find in studies of taxonomy, for example. It's a type of inclusional relationship such that words are nested in hierarchical structures within the network of the mental lexicon. So a Dalmatian and a beagle and a bulldog are all types of dog. Dogs and elephants are types of mammal, etc. But it's really important to remember that scientific taxonomy does not map directly onto any natural human language, right? We all have our folk taxonomies that are just as important to us as any scientific taxonomy. So when I go to the supermarket, I look for strawberries with the rest of the berries, even though a biologist might tell me that a strawberry isn't really a berry. And in fact, if I wanted to look for berries, I should be looking for watermelons and chili peppers. But we don't really care about that because in natural language, you know, we have our own folk taxonomies that are also built upon utilitarian factors and use, you know, in food, in medicine, in poison, etc., and not necessarily only in terms of, you know, relatedness and DNA. So here's a good example from the Wayampi people who live in the northern Amazon. You might look at these birds and think that one of them stands out as a little bit different. This is a class of birds. It's a group of birds that have the same, you know, the same name. So what is this falcon doing there? And what can indigenous languages tell us about these kinds of surprising finds where you would think that one member of the group, you know, seems a little odd? Well, it turns out that this is you know, a vegetarian carnivore. It's a frugivore. It's a falcon that doesn't eat meat, and it has exactly the same diet as the other toucans. And this group of toucans compete with humans also for this type of fruit. So in fact, the naming system reveals something about the local ecology that you know, an outsider wouldn't immediately recognize, and you certainly wouldn't be able to tell if you were only communicating with people in Spanish or Portuguese. Of course, looking at the mental lexicon more generally, you can find a lot of indigenous naming systems which reveal ecological aspects of the particular species being named. So as in Darrell Posey's very famous work on bees in Kayapo, the bees had names that tell us something about what that particular species is or does, or how it behaves. Again, this is not really a property of you know, exotic languages, rainforest languages, pre-industrial languages. English does this too. So when I arrived here in Indiana, one of the first little critters that I learned a new name for was a carpenter bee. How did I learn about a carpenter bee? Because it was drilling a hole in my deck. And, you know, I will never forget the name carpenter bee because the folk name carpenter bee tells you something about what the bee does. It drills holes in my deck. So names of bees in Kayapo reflect their behavior, their nest geometry, their ecological niche, their physical characteristics, as well as their use to humans. For example, the quality and quantity of the honey, the quality of the resins or wax, the edibility of the pollen or larvae are all encoded in folk names. And here's a picture of some bees just because they're so beautiful. Ecological knowledge is not only in open class items, of course, as I mentioned, but also in closed class items, in grammatical morphemes. So just in case you have forgotten what you were taught in school about morphemes, morphemes are these small little grammatical elements, such as the ed in played, the ing in playing. If we say there is a turkey on the table, the indefinite article a tells us that this is an entity, a bounded object. If we say there is some turkey on the table, it tells us to conceptualize it as a substance. In English, we have the and a and some, and these are kind of hard to learn for second language learners. They take decades, even though it's a very small system and it's relatively uncomplicated. But in Piaroa, which is spoken in Venezuela, whenever you pronounce a noun, you have to use with it one of over 100 different noun classifiers, fully 75 of which are either botanical or ecological. So the addition of roe means that whatever it is you're talking about is a kind of hanging, branching, stemmed fruit bunch. If you say oe at the end of the noun, it means that whatever you're talking about is one of the rosette-shaped herbaceous plants, etc. There's a whole bunch of these morphemes that encode a tremendous amount of information, which is not as surprising when you realize that this is a community that has access to hundreds of edible or medicinal plants that are extremely important to their daily survival. You also have ecological knowledge, not so much just in lexical items, but in certain aspects of the grammar, in expressions of space and time. Several communities in different parts of the world measure distance and give directions in terms of the direction of the local water flow. For example, in Tuvan communities in Mongolia, Tabaluhan people in Indonesia, you don't really say, I'm going to the village. You have to first locate yourself in terms of the nearest free-flowing water, and then say, I'm upstreaming to the village, or I'm downstreaming to the herd, for example. I do this with my students in class. I ask them to describe where they're sitting in relation to the student next to them. So rather than speaking egocentrically and saying, this person is to my left, this person is to my right, this person is cross-stream of me, that person is upstream of me, right? Because we live on a campus with a river flowing through it. And if they think hard enough, they can locate themselves in that way. Hanoi people in the Philippines also use water flow, but in addition can specify 6 canonical wind directions. So it's important to realize that when if biocultural diversity research is actually happening on the ground in a particular place with a particular people, spatial systems and temporal systems are not just, good enough systems to get around from one glade to another. These systems can be extremely complicated. So when I first had my first experience of tropical rainforest, it was in South America, 1989, 1990. The Tucanoan people of the Vaupés region in the Colombian Amazon see the rock of Ni, a particular set of rocks actually in a river as the center of the world, essentially. This is where the Pirapirana River crosses as it goes from north to south, and where it crosses the equator, which is going from east to west. The constellation Orion isn't in the northern sky or in the southern sky, as it is for people who live in temperate regions of the world, but it rises from east, it traverses the sky across the equator. So the central star of Orion's belt, Al-Nilam, is conceived of being directly above the Rock of Ni. Orion itself is in the center of a gigantic stellar hexagon with Castor and Pollux at one side and Achernar in the south, and the stars of Aldebaran and Sirius defining the two sides. And these stars are linked with places with sacred waterfalls on Earth to create a gigantic hexagonal prism. So other spatial systems that are not familiar necessarily from Western colonial languages can be extremely complex. And it's only by communicating with people in indigenous languages that you're going to get a sense of where you are. Let's look quickly at time. And then I think I'll bring it to a close. So as is well known, lots of different cultures have different names for months. And where you are in the United States will also depend on what's happening in the environment. So April is maple sugar moon in Ojibwe, but it's blackberry moon in Choctaw. And these are spoken in very different parts of the country in very different environmental conditions. It's geese laying eggs moon in Dakota. But this is still two systems that are relying on cycles of the moon. Everybody's familiar that the word month comes from moon, right? Moonth. But a lot of cultures calculate seasons not only in terms of months, but in terms of other things that are happening in the environment. One of my favorite collaborations between indigenous, in this case, Aboriginal peoples and academic scientists is in Australia, where the national organization CSIRO have partnered with lots of Aboriginal tribes, especially in the Northern Territories, to produce beautiful calendars that put together indigenous knowledge of what's going on from season to season, overlaid onto a 12-month calendar. So here's an example from Kunwinshku. Kunwinshku in the Northern Territory doesn't have spring, summer, spring, summer, autumn, winter. It has 6 major seasons that are defined appropriately in terms of the environment in which everybody lives. And they're extremely specific about what happens in those seasons. And this is just the overall framework. Within these 6 seasons, you also have other seasons which overlap with them. So for example, in Yekke, it's the beginning of the dry time, and dragonflies will appear, and the pink turkey bush will flower, etc. That, for example, in Kurung, the air, you'll know it's Kurung because the air will be filled with the scent of flowers. With a certain very fragrant blossoms will open. And this will tell you that it's time to hunt magpie goose and northern long-necked turtles. It's also time to burn the floodplain. So here's an example of what some of these beautiful sort of synthesized calendars look like. You can see, I don't know if I can actually go closer or if I'm going to mess everything up with Zoom. If I can go a little closer here, you can see that you've got January, February, March, April going around the outside. And if you go a little closer, you can see that there are these main seasons like Kujuk there, which don't correspond to Western months at all. But then inside these big main seasons, you also have other seasons like the fat fish season, for example. Let me see if I can get out of this and back without messing up the slides. And of course, ecological knowledge can be woven into texts and sayings and stories and songs. It's not just the names for things. It's not just names of species or names of seasons or names of directions. Or it's also people who are interested in how ecological knowledge is encoded in language should also be looking at a bigger level. It's songs, texts and narratives from religious rites, sayings, etc. So the Wayampi people of northern Brazil have a Taru Taru festival, the festival of the dark-billed cuckoo. And there's a song, and the song tells us that when the breeze blows at the beginning of the dry season, says the song, and the stars of the Pleiades appear in the early morning, the Taru Taru drinks fermented maniac and starts to sing. And then he gets really drunk. And everybody at the festival gets really drunk. And then he continues singing until the sweet potatoes begin to sprout and the Pleiades appear in the evening sky. So this wonderful, very short narrative in song links together both the bird, the stars, and the food. And again, just to stress the fact that this is something that human language can do. If you look at pre-industrial traditions in Europe, you find the same sorts of things in Poland and Italy and England and all of the other places I've looked. So for example, on the island of Guernsey, which is between England and France, they speak a dialect of English and they speak a dialect of French. And in French dialect, it used to be said, quand tu veux épargner le claquet, mets tes laines dans ton bateau et t'en vas au macré, which means when you see the foxgloves bloom, put your nets in your boat and set off for mackerel. Okay, there are other issues with regard to translating into languages of wider communication like English and Spanish, etc. But I don't want to use up too much time. I think I've spoken enough and I look forward to hearing Marianne. So I think I will end my presentation there. Thank you very much.
Okay, it's my turn, I guess. Thank you so much, David. That was a wonderful synopsis of many of those different dimensions that as linguists and ethnobiologists we do and say and study. So the presentation I have actually zeroes in on one particular people, the Secwepemc, and on one particular aspect of communication and meaning making, which is talking about fires. Can everybody see this?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I just need to start my show here. And that's still all visible, I hope. So yeah, thanks for having me. And I just would like to also acknowledge the territory on which the University of Florida finds itself in, that of the Seminole and Timucua peoples. And so the place that I'll tell you a bit about is my nation, which is by marriage, adoption, and long residence, the Secwepemc people in South Central Interior BC. And we live in a really rich and biodiverse environment here, with as many as 9 different biogeoclimatic zones that range from sagebrush steppes and grasslands and cactus that is kind of the northern outlier of the Great Sonora Desert, to alpine and subalpine areas and montane forests, grasslands in between. So our territory is about 160 to 180,000 square kilometers. Only 1% of that is indigenous reserves. And population is somewhere around 11,000, but on reserves is about 65 or so percent of that. And similar to other indigenous languages in Western North America, our language, Secwepemc has seen a tremendous decline as a result of residential schools, boarding schooling, the incredible dominance of English in the workplace and everywhere else, government policies, you name it, So we only have about 1% of people that are what we consider fluent or birth speakers of Secwepemctsín. Here we go. And I'd like to acknowledge also the elders who, for the past nearly 40 years, have guided my work and have taught me. This is just a collage of just a few of them here. And many of them are passed away now, but a couple of them are still alive, and I continue to work with them. So we have ancient oral histories that can provide us with clues about events in the long ago past that refer to pervasive climate change. And it's quite interesting when the ethnographer James Tate, who was sent around by Franz Boas in the early 1900s, at a time when really people knew nothing about the ancient habitation of northwestern North America or other parts of North America. He asked elders at the time, what do people say? What was it like when they first lived here? And they called it a time of great winds, heat, drought, and fire, and floods. Sounds familiar within the kind of times of climate change we live in, but not caused human. But turning to language and the importance of language, and I want to keep in mind that we need to contextualize this with the fact that we've lost much of our language. We've been able to document it, and we're revitalizing it. But many of the decisions and ways in which people think about fires, both wildfires, natural fires, and the kind of cultural fires that our ancestors used to set to keep the landscape living, for the most part is talked about in English nowadays. But here is a little glimpse into what's out there in the world beyond that. And in 2010, I asked the elders in my community, Skitchison, what they thought about the connection between language and land. And this is what they said. Eta is wis demet micht me slon demach gedenkt, a heel met je mes kokend wilgt, me kuyusumt, me kenmisk stemt aus gesleppendem, et micht gukstels is to witendels. So basically, they pointed out this inseparable relationship between language, people, and land, and the consequences of losing language. And I also want to actually carry on with another saying by Peter Mühlhäuser, who also reminded us life in a particular human environment is dependent on people's ability to talk about it. So that's kind of the stakes of losing ways of talking about it in the indigenous language, that we may miss out on some of the richness and nuance, but also some of the issues that we ought to be talking about. And I'm reminded of our colleague in times of environmental change, disasters. I'm reminded of our colleague Anvita Abbey's work with Andamanese speakers, where she showed how cultural knowledge embedded in specific endangered languages has literally saved lives and livelihoods during catastrophic events like the Indian tsunami of 2004, when people knew how to save themselves because they knew the trees they needed to go into and how to survive in them. And of course, that went back to the knowledge connected to the language of what you call them. And we have other studies that have produced interesting information about the indigenous language knowledge, climate change, and disaster management. One study was done by one of my colleagues at SFU, Nick Rio,
who worked with the speakers and non-speakers of Yupik and Inupiaq in northeastern Alaska, and recorded and showed how the loss of language between generations led to people being able to express less what were favorable or unfavorable weather conditions for going out on the ice, for being out on the land. And he didn't, unfortunately, at this point, directly document that through the linguistic knowledge, but nonetheless recorded that the speaker said English is less precise, less direct, and it's because of those very detailed directional terms in the language, ways of describing conditions of sea ice, of snow, weather, and so forth, that that kind of knowledge was perceived as less precise in English than it was in Yupik and Inupiaq. And I think we need more work on this that can document weather formations, geography in a time of change, and but also around traditional knowledge. So one thing, I want to prefix this by saying we in our community here and in our nation have had tremendous wildfires in the last several years. I think 190,000 square kilometers of forest burned in one big fire in 2017 and again in 2021. And we were evacuated for 5-6 weeks at a time. And so it left a deep mark among both elders, community members, leadership in the community. And it was an, to say the least, interesting time of being caught between jurisdictions. But it interested me about how do we actually talk about fire and how do we talk about burning, both in a sense of basically the terms that exist. And if we think of English ways of like fire, fire can be human set, or fire can be naturally occurring. It can be accidental, or it can be volitional or purposeful. And in Secwepemctsín, which is one of the 23 languages in the Salish family, we quite deeply distinguish between around different lexemes and lexical roots of fire that is volitional, somebody sets it, and fire that is non-volitional, that happens because of events and things in nature. And so there's quite a vocabulary that addresses sort of that fairly deep, profound division between those kind of concepts. And of course, when fire is something that you make or set on purpose, whether it's the fire in a stove, which is one way of talking about it and has one type of lexical root, or if it's a fire that you set on the land because you want to burn the land to get rid of old fuel, to create better forage for animals, to enhance the growth of berry crops and root crops, then you use one set of terms. But if it's a fire that is actually happening accidentally beyond human control, you use a different set of words. So the approach that we, with a group of us, have been using to map this out is that my husband, Ron Ignace, calls it walking on two legs. So it's guided by an indigenous worldview, but at the same time, we dialogue the kind of knowledge that comes out of the indigenous language and its concepts with what we can glean and learn from Western sciences. And of course, in a sense that it's also connected to ethical and accountable and reciprocal ways of doing things. So I'm going to give you a few concepts here that are, if you want, philosophical concepts that are driven by Secwepemc law, indigenous law, that talk about relations on and with the land. And the first one is the one said Knaus, that we have what Enrique Salmon called kin-centric relations between humans. And here I've used trees as one aspect of that. Trees are considered the mothers of people, both in history and in the way they function together. And thus humans have a role to be yuchminmen, or caretakers of trees. And there is a coyote story that actually references that way back in the beginning of time, when Coyote couldn't find a human wife, he married a tree. And that one really stands as a metaphor for the reciprocal relationship that humans and trees developed, but where humans then also become the caretakers of trees. And of course, that kind of concepts in the last 20 some years has been explored by foresters and biologists like Suzanne Simard in Finding the Mother Tree, and other works like that have pointed to the social life of trees, the role that mycorrhizal messengers, fungi have by way of enabling communication. And but in the Secwepemc worldview, we are said Knaus. And the second concept I want to mention is that how we interact with all beings on the land. And it derives from the issue that humans are poor and pitiful, lest plants, animals, and fish offer themselves, as we call it, gachmenchut. And again, it creates reciprocal relations and accountability between different beings on the land, and then the need for humans to give thanks and to look after the land and to protect the different kind of beings, species, you name it, on the land. And the final concept, again, that I want to talk about, and these, as you may see, all function as verbs in the language rather than as nouns. So they're acts of doing. And it's the term geënskt. And it's hard to translate into English. The lexical suffix "kt" or "eskt" can be land and sky, so like the firmament above you. And basically, they will turn on you and cause you harm if you show reckless behavior with the environment. And so what that translates into is that geënskt means that it's our role as Secwepemc to protect the integrity of our homeland and the long-lasting impacts of careless resource extraction with environmental, geological, hydrological, health, cultural impacts severely compromise our ability to act as caretakers. And so it applies to Secwepemc people not being reckless, but it also applies to outsiders who come in to try to extract resources, that it's our ability to prevent that from happening, if that is the case. So getting back to fires and how to talk about fires, but also to recreate by way of conservation or ecological restoration cultural fires. This is what our place looked like in July 2021. The Sparks Lake wildfire, which I think killed off about 100,000 plus square kilometers of forest, was about 200 yards from our place. And so it led to lots of conversation and rethinking about the role of fire. And this shows some of the destruction in our environment. And it shows on the right side here a place that's a spiritual sacred place, Pelucas, which is a waterfall under which people used to train for guardian spirit power. And it's obviously quite burnt out. And so one way of restoring is to regenerate landscape burning or cultural fires, knowing how to burn, what fires do, what kind of fires do what, and what the impacts are of fires on enhancing berry crops, enabling reseeding and regrowth of tree species, and also clearing the forest floor of fuel. And of course, the idea behind that is that our landscape, our land, we're not wild. Some very interesting work by my colleague, Dr. Laurie Daniels from the University of BC Faculty of Forestry and her students has shown how pyrodendrochronology, so counting tree rings and taking account of the fire scars in trees, some of them 500, 600 years old, in the southern interior has actually shown that something like 75% of fires that these several hundred year-old trees lived through were set by humans. So fire management was a very pervasive part of preventing forest fires. And they obviously enhance a number of root and berry species. And my husband was fortunate when he was a young child and young man that he was raised by his great-grandparents. And so he learned the skill of burning and also on how to talk about and reference cultural fires and burning in the landscape. In BC, and I think likewise in pretty much most parts of continental North America and the US, burning was criminalized beginning in the late 1800s, early 20th century, when management of forests for timber with economic value kind of set in. But Ron's great-grandfather continued to still do burning in a variety of creative ways. And so I'm just, yeah, this just shows how you can clear the land doing that. And I just want to get back to actually a way of how we document the same thing that David talked about. The knowledge of ecology and ecological indicators as captured in stories through the particular vocabularies and terms, but also importantly through the relationships that are mapped out in these stories. So when it comes to burning, we have a narrative. It's about a young woman who sees the sandhill cranes traveling high above our valley. And they always come every year. We're in a north-south valley, so they come and fly north. Actually, we just saw them last week, so about this time of year. And then they come back in around the middle of September, flying south. And the time when they fly high above the valley here and gather flocks coincides with a particular pattern of winds. Where in the morning when it's still fairly cool, the wind blows from south to north, and then you get updrafts in the middle of the days as the temperatures warm. And by usually around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the wind starts to turn. And then by 3, 4 in the afternoon, it turns. So if you set a fire going north in the morning, and then you take account of the wind's going to turn around, the fire eventually will put itself out. because of the 180-degree shift in winds. And that's encapsulated in the word Hyeanwulch, which on the one hand addresses the sandhill cranes doing this circling around, but it also references the wind. And there's an ecological indicator embedded in all that, in that the sandhill cranes tell us that it's time to burn, not so much in the valleys, but to start thinking about burning, which places do you need to burn a little higher up. And I think one of the most fascinating things about ecological indicators is actually, sometimes they tell you about co-relationships in one environment, but if they tell you about co-relationships between environments, they actually are a really important way where you can make observations, but then that you need to do things in a different environment that you can't see. And that might be miles away, and a little bit of time away in time as well. Yeah, and so one of the challenges then is the practicing and recreating landscape burning. This shows what it looks like behind our place. And this is also in light of what are often bureaucratic measures by departments and ministries that make it very difficult to do that, because you need to be able to respond to ecological indicators, not to budgetary cycles. And finally, the connection between, again, in ecological indicators, between knowledge and species and the processes happening, ecological processes, that we can improve with landscape burning, shown here. We've been doing this for the last 20-some years to actually bring back two important, I guess, keystone species, cultural keystone species. The one on the left here on the bottom, that's they're called yellow bells in English, Tsuauya. And they're kind of the harbinger of spring, the first edible bulbs that come out in spring, usually around the 1st of April or so. And the second one here is large-fruited, called biscuit root, but also large-fruited desert parsley. And it's an important food plant in early spring, although it is not really edible once it matures. And it's also an important medicinal plant that the root is used by women during pregnancy. And the song of Huchla, the meadowlark, in that early part of spring, after they first come back, migrate back in middle of March to about now. So the meadowlarks, as in many other cultures, birds in their songs give us messages that are then translated into indigenous languages or whichever language that where people live. And in around this time of year, the meadowlark song is tu you wasted my large-fruited desert parsley on me, meaning that if you don't harvest it now, it's no longer any good. So again, it gives us a fascinating and daily message about what to harvest and what to do. And if we only speak English to try to convey those, what are often complex messages between species on the land, animals and plants, winds and land formations and so forth, I think we lose a lot. And I'm finding in my other capacity outside of teaching ethnobotany and ethnoecology and working as a language documentarian, I teach Secwepemctsín and another indigenous language. And I'm finding that it's actually those kind of connections that motivate students and learners to want to get that knowledge back. Okay, Chuck, that's my talk.
Thank you, Marianne. That was amazing. And all of the speakers really gave us wonderful overview of the rich linkages between knowledge, languages, and resource management, and the importance of understanding and engaging with these different kinds of knowledge and through language as we think about biocultural conservation or resource management or ecosystem restoration. I don't know if there are general questions. I mean, I could tell from the chat that people have been very engaged, very fascinated. I don't know if there's something that you particularly want to add, or if there are specific questions, you could please raise your hands or put them in the chat. I mean, I'm most interested in kind of the selfish operational application of these approaches in academia, and thinking about connecting linguistic diversity and biological and cultural diversity in academic spaces. So both David and Marianne teach linguistics, but they also relate that to ethnobiology. I'm wondering if there are approaches that we can incorporate in our academic programs and practices that help to strengthen these linkages. There are specific ways we can engage in our, selfishly thinking about our tropical conservation and development program, where we have strong interactions between social sciences and biological sciences, but not so much interaction with linguistics. I don't know, Rick Stepp was cited as some of the studies that you presented, Luisa, and he's here. And I'm wondering, maybe you could comment, Rick. Oh, there you are.
Yes. That's always confusing with the Hollywood Square screen here. Yeah, thanks to all the speakers. That was really welcome and interesting and innovative thoughts. So it's just really nice to have you, at least virtually, as part of the University of Florida community. It's a big question, Bob, that you pose, and I'm sure all three of our panelists and many of our audience has some approaches to that as well. I'm going to sort of preface that with maybe an even larger question that gets at the root of what's going on, and it's why we just don't have more linguists working on endangered languages. 7,000 plus languages, there's not even one linguist per language. And there's entire regions and certainly individual languages that no one's working on. So that's a big problem to solve. If we can do that, I think by virtue of having people working in small scale traditional indigenous communities, you can't help but start to look at issues related to ecological knowledge. You can't help but start to look at really pressing conservation questions, because there's not many places in the world that communities aren't feeling some sort of pressure from the outside, and all the reasons that we see biodiversity being lost. The factors are quite similar for loss of linguistic cultural diversity. So that's probably where we need to start. Just to give you one anecdote that kind of points to this, linguists discovering how important environment is once they started digging into it. Bob Lockman, who worked with the Tzotzil Maya, and Luisa, I'm sure, knows him or knew him. Unfortunately, passed away during the pandemic. But spent over half a century working Tzotzil, had native fluency in Tzotzil, and started working on a really amazing dictionary. In fact, it was so amazing at the time, one of the blowhard Congress people in the U.S. Gave it up one of these like waste of money awards. So he just didn't think it was important. Well, it was important, clearly. And so I think it was a badge of honor that Bob got that so-called award. But anyway, yeah, he had pretty much finished up the dictionary, and he was talking with Dennis Breedlove, who was a botanist that worked with Brent Berlin and a lot of other folks, cataloging the biodiversity. And so it's one of these early examples of social scientists working with biological scientists, and you know, not necessarily explicitly focused on conservation. And it was very much production of academic knowledge, but certainly was fundamental to conservation efforts. Now, in any case, Breedlove looks through the dictionary and said, well, where are all the plant names? And Bob says, well, here, I got one here and I got one here. And he's like, no. There's a lot more that you need to do. And so Bob thought that he would spend another few weeks and take care of that and kind of add it as an appendix to the dictionary. Ended up he spent another few years working with Breedlove doing that, and they produced not just one book, but 2 entire volumes devoted to the ethnobotany of not the whole Tzotzil Maya, but the Tzotzil of San Lorenzo Zinactan. And it really just shows you the depth of how much knowledge just in one community. And the other beauty about that work, and then I'll pass the baton on, is that the first book is very much kind of species inventory, the local name, that sort of thing. But the second book is all really wonderful stories, and it really brought the cultural aspects to it. And so it's tying all that together is what we need to do here. And it's a really steep hill to climb, and we could use an order of magnitude greater number of people, not just in linguistics, but in ethnobiology alone. We face the same problem. And I think that folks that work primarily in biodiversity conservation also feel like they're underrepresented in terms of people working on these efforts. So part of it is getting the word out to the general public, and that's what's been so great about TerraLingua and Luisa's work and other organizations as well, is bringing that to people to start to let them know that there's this unrecognized extinction crisis going on. And that 20 years ago, 30 years ago, very few people knew that. The word about biodiversity gotten out, but not about the loss of languages. That's not the same now, though. And I talked to a lot of younger people, undergrad students, and they have some inkling that this is an issue. They may not feel it to be as a pressing problem as the loss of biodiversity, but it's on the radar now. And so I think if we can keep those efforts up, some of this will happen organically, but we also need to work on the policy realm and find support for this from governments and NGOs and ultimately the donor class.
So more investment, more recognition, more resources. Go ahead, Luisa. You're still on mute.
You need to unmute, Luisa.
Maybe Zoom automatically mutes you when you're not.
Yeah, it does. Several thoughts spurred by what Rick just said and what David and Marianne said. For one thing, yes, if you can't become linguistically adept as a biologist or a conservation biologist or an ethnobiologist, try at least to have a linguist on your team, someone who's, of course, oriented the way David and Marianne so eminently are. The role of a linguist can be exactly of the sort that Rick described with the work of Bob Lachlan. creating not just dictionaries, but cultural dictionaries,
Yes.
where all that ecological knowledge and a lot more is encoded and interconnected with the stories through which it is conveyed and transmitted, et cetera, all that is an integral contribution to biocultural conservation. And as I said, the proof patent that we found was when we reviewed all these bioculturally oriented field projects for our book, the ones that were most successful at achieving bioculture conservation were indigenous-led from an indigenous worldview and included language conservation and revitalization prominently. And another way of thinking of why that is precisely the non intertranslatability of words, concepts, and more from indigenous languages to whatever majority world language is spoken in a given area, and that was brought home to me when I was doing field work. Well, also in the island of Chiapas with Tzeltal Maya people from the community of Tenejapa. And I had this absolutely brilliant collaborator, Petul Hernandez Guzman. I was studying not specifically ethnobiology, but ethnomedicine and the way people thought about health and illness. And plant names did come up in that context. And Petul, my collaborator, was translating our recordings into Spanish. It was getting very frustrated that he didn't know Spanish well enough because he didn't know how to translate certain plant names, certain concepts, et cetera. And I had to tell him, Petul, it's not you, it's Spanish that doesn't have those words. Because the Spaniards, I guess, never cared to look. And so they didn't create names or expressions for those words and expressions in Tzeltal. And that really tells you something about what gets lost, not only in translation, but also if linguistic acculturation happens and people end up abandoning their own languages, the knowledge that is so tightly woven into the language, it just doesn't translate.
If I could reply to some of Rick's questions and also touched on something that Luisa was pointing out. If it's okay, just for 30 seconds, can I share a screen again? Just to point out that I think people working on documenting endangered languages are already thinking of dictionaries in a different way. So a lot of work does, in fact, this works. This is an example. I don't know how well you can see this. So a lot of dictionary work does now include indigenous definitions as well as definitions in the majority language. So this is a kind of a gall that grows on that you can find on bloodwood trees in Northern Australia. And you can define it as a gall on a bloodwood or a bush coconut, or etc. But also they make sure to include the Eastern and Matier native speaker definition as well, which is always not just a translation to translation, right? It's always a bit of encyclopedic knowledge. So the bloodwood gall grows on the bloodwood tree. We pick them and then split them open. They have a little grub inside, a nice tasting one. We used to eat it. So this sort of definition is more normally in dictionaries. And also people, I think the last few dictionaries I've had a look at, I don't spend my life reading dictionaries, but the last few I've had a look at do try to include things which are very hard to translate. And they do that by having explanations given by native speakers. So what does Nyarli mean in Walbury in Australia? Well, it's a certain way of sleeping. And we don't have a word for it in English. but it's a word that describes sleeping with your head to the east and your feet to the west, on your side with your stomach facing south and your back facing north. Just to reiterate the fact that what Luisa is saying is very important. I really do 100% believe that it's incredibly important. And fortunately, I think some people are listening, and a lot of work in endangered languages is incorporating these sorts of criticisms. That's my impression, certainly, these days. But to go back briefly to Bob's point, thinking about how this sort of thing fits in with current academic frameworks and how we can develop these sorts of interrelationships. I wish I was more optimistic. I go through periods of being optimistic and pessimistic. I think many of us who do this kind of interdisciplinary work are often alone in our departments. And while we might have support from our institutions, there's not a lot happening at the institution that really is truly interdisciplinary. So for example, if you want to get tenure, you better not work on this sort of stuff, right? Because you want to get, I made this pivot with the security of tenure, knowing that I could take risks in writing things that it wouldn't be so easy to publish in mainstream journals, which are all very siloed. What I found encouraging is that there are places and there are groups of people like you in Florida. Recently I visited the Center for Biocultural Diversity in Kent, where Roy Ellen was for many years, and Raj Puri is now, Miguel Alexiades was there. That's the sort of institution that's fantastic for doing this sort of work. But they're also being starved by funding from their university, and their future is uncertain. So I don't know, this is a time where in academia, we really have to think about how to truly implement interdisciplinary research, not only within, but by breaking some of the systems that we're in, I think. I was recently invited to an NSF panel to write a white paper. This has been organized by Christine Hildebrandt and Raquel Sapien. There are maybe 4 or 5 of us in different working groups, like indigenous languages and land and community and politics. And I'm in the land group, language and land. So we have 2 geographers, an archaeologist, an anthropologist, a linguist, and an ethnobotanist. And as we write this white paper for NSF funding in the Endangered Languages Program, it used to be called DEL, it's now called DLI. The question is, how is the government prepared to fund interdisciplinary work like that? You know, is it important? Because it often doesn't fit in to the kinds of rigid academic structures that are currently in place. So I think, I don't know, this is the generation. You know, this interdisciplinary turn has to be made real somehow, I think. And I think it is a challenge, Bob. I think it's a struggle that I feel engaged in rather than purely optimistic about.
Okay. Well, Marianne, do you want to bring some optimism?
I hope so. Yeah, why not? First of all, I think what Luisa said earlier on, that in this day and age, projects that involve the research on indigenous languages, indigenous lands, and biodiversity need to be indigenous-led or co-led, and as opposed to be driven by the interests of academies. And in the end, obviously, indigenous peoples themselves, especially on the heels of losing languages, need to be the beneficiaries of the work, but hopefully with allies of people trained in various disciplines that can each then contribute to that kind of knowledge building and knowledge mobilization. I'm finding, and I live in Canada. I actually came from the States, but not for long. In Canada, since about 2015-16, when it comes to language and when it comes to language and culture, but also in general, the involvement of academia in work regarding Indigenous people, our Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action have had some tangible impact on how Indigenous research is done in communities or not. And it's a work in progress. But I think from the vantage point of Indigenous communities, there's progress made. And in the right direction. And I think it can be something that definitely should in other jurisdictions also guide the reclamation of knowledge and reconciliation.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I couldn't agree more. I guess I will share very briefly an experience that I had a few months ago in September. I visited for the first time northern British Columbia. I had never been there, and visited the area between the mighty Skeena and Nass rivers. And the moment I set foot there, I felt that something was different. And then as I went along, I began to understand what it was. And it was that those were really territories of life of the First Nations that had lived there for since time immemorial, and that had been at the forefront of reclaiming that role, the rights, but also the right to have those traditional responsibilities toward the land. And you could feel it. It was a physical feeling. I even have a hard time describing it, how powerful it was. But it really told me in a very emotional and spiritual way the meaning of Indigenous-led conservation. It just extraordinary. Anybody who has a chance should go there and just experience it for themselves. And of course, language runs through all of it.
Mm-hmm.
Faisal?
Sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you to the speakers. I've really enjoyed the session today, and I've learned a lot. I have a question about language and how it is used in policy, and particularly conservation policy. So Luisa mentioned that one of the really important initiatives, or perhaps milestones in advancing biocultural approaches to stewardship, was the Declaration of Belém, which recognized the intimate link between biological and cultural diversity. We now have just concluded the negotiations and drafting of a very important international nature agreement called the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which probably, it's not great, but it has gone much, much further in terms of recognizing the linkages between culture and nature. It upholds Indigenous knowledge systems, Indigenous legal traditions, governance, in many elements of the text. However, I was really struck by Marianne's presentation on cultural burning and the complexity by which culture burning happens, and that is reflected in the different words of her people. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that. Like, how do we influence international policy in a way that perhaps is reflective of the biocultural diversity of the people on whose lands conservation is happening in most cases, sometimes without Indigenous people's consent? Thanks.
Well, I can briefly address this, and this is something that I worked on with Luisa. And also before getting into that, though, I'd just add that we are seeing more and more pieces of policy at the international level that are working in the favor of Indigenous people. UN DRIP is another great example of that. But it's piecemeal. I think part of the problem with CBD is that it's premised on, from the perspective of Indigenous people, a flawed framework in that it puts all the rights at the state level, the nation state level. And so that alone makes it really difficult. And I'm glad that folks, I'm glad you're working on it. But just to give one story about some of the hard work that happens and then sort of gets negated. Luisa and I worked on the Global Environmental Outlook that's published by the UNEP. And if you're not familiar with that document, it's kind of the blueprint for UN member nations for their environmental policy that comes out every few years. And when was Luisa, in 2005, 2006?
6 or 7, yeah.
Yeah. They, for the biodiversity chapter, they invited us to say, they said, hey, we want to put culture in the biodiversity chapter. And that was a huge leap for them, because prior, if you go back to any of these other, this was GO4, you go back to the other first 3, there was really no mention of people other than as disturbing agents and as problems, not solutions. And my recollection, it's pretty tedious work to do that kind of stuff. Every sentence has to be negotiated and back and forth. And, for those of us that move at a little faster pace, it's hard. So I have utmost respect for people that work in those and hammer those sentences out, sentence or word by word. But in any case, that came out, and then they basically took it out the next time. And because I think it must have bothered some people. So from that perspective, we were effective. I don't think it was seen as superfluous. I think it probably was controversial. And because as soon as you start talking about that, you can't just talk about culture with regards to biodiversity without also talking about Indigenous rights and intellectual property and land sovereignty and all these factors that are so crucial. And, we know how to solve this. Land sovereignty is probably the biggest single thing we can do. Everything else comes into play. We can focus on preservation of cultural diversity and linguistic diversity, but without sovereign access to lands, it in most instances isn't going to go very well. And, that's not anything new. I mean, you can go back to Bernie Nietzschman, the rule of indigenous environments, where he said where there are indigenous people with a homeland, there are still intact biodiversity. And I think by and large, that's true throughout the world.
Marianne, you want to add?
Yeah, just around a couple of practical measures, getting back to what I think it was Faisal who said that, right? Who asked that question. First of all, I think it's really important that we publish and co-publish in journals and whatever kind of media that are outside of our immediate disciplines. If I, publish my work among anthropological linguists or linguistic anthropologists, I'm preaching to the converted. But to actually publish our findings and with compelling evidence, but also in a way that convinces, in the kind of journals that are led by policymakers, has a bigger chance to make change. One thing in the last few years, and it comes on the heels of some decades of experience, we've really also got away from saying that we can integrate, braid in, or weave in indigenous knowledges, because let's face it, we're functioning in a power imbalance between those in government that make decisions and those in indigenous communities who are trying to keep their land intact or trying to restore the land. And so we've called it in the last few years dialoguing, but on equal terms. And I think those messages, we just need to keep giving them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there is no quick fix for the problem that Faisal raised and Rick also spoke to. We just have to keep doing it, keep at it. And of course, there's also issues of generational change. Just 2 days ago, I was on a panel of the so-called Council of the Elders of the International Society of Ethnobiology, where we are trying to reconstruct historic memory of how that society arose as a absolutely non-classical academic society, but as the embodiment of the marriage of knowledge and action. And, younger generations of ethnobiologists don't know that history. So in part, there's also that aspect. You have to keep history alive and keep the connection between the things that we did in in an era that maybe was more activist in many ways than society is today, and continue to make it relevant and known, and just keep fighting.
I agree.
I think I've approached this whole sort of interdisciplinary field in the opposite way that most academic research gets done. I think Luisa knows this. So I had the opportunity to teach an interdisciplinary freshman class, a first-year class at my university. So I started out with activism and consciousness raising, and moved later into research. So this is on a very, very small scale. Teaching between 60 and 100 undergraduates every year, but then sending those out to the local school system. So we reach every elementary school in the school system once a year. It's a small thing, it's one town, but we've reached about 3,600 kids so far over the last few years. And if there's lots of local attempts to make a difference on a small scale, I'm given hope by the realization that most major progressive social change happens from the bottom up. It's grassroots movements that make politicians change what they do. It's not really, I don't have a lot of faith that our appeal to NSF will have any particular effect. But actually, there is a rising in consciousness, I think, that we can pin back to those early days in the 1990s and the beginning of the biocultural diversity movement, and Luisa, of course, and her co-travelers, and it continues apace. I mean, I see Jim Nations is here, who doesn't know me and I don't know him, but I've been tremendously moved by his books and his writings over the last year. I just finished your book on Lacandon peoples, and and I'm spreading the word. I think this is authentic resilience on the part of indigenous peoples, fight, and it needs to be known. People need to talk about this. And the fact is, most people are living in a state of ignorance. Most politicians are living in a state of ignorance. Most teachers are teaching their kids, but this is the way it always begins, right? But with grassroots movements, you can affect big change. So, people can vote who couldn't vote before, people who can be free who were once in bondage. I mean, I really believe that if the more and more we do at a little local level without giving up, and the more we connect with each other and the more we form networks, then I feel that we can affect positive change.
Well, thank you all. It's a really inspiring and positive and uplifting way to end. And it's really been positive and uplifting to have all of you here, all of the participants. I want to thank our speakers. today's panelists, Marianne, David, and Luisa, but also our other speakers in this series. I want to thank Francisca for organizing. And yes, for all of you for participating and learning together and being part of a broader movement. And so I do hope we can continue, and I want to thank you very much.
Onward.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very much appreciated.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thanks.